My name is Phillis Wheatley, and I was born on May 8, 1753. I was the first African American woman to have my poetry published. 7 years into my life, I was kidnapped from my home in West Africa. I was put on a ship and brought to Boston, Massachusetts against my will. Up until this point, I was free in my home country. I was not prepared for the life I was going to face in America. I survived the long boat ride to Boston, but suffered from many health issues along the way. The captain of the ship didn't think I was going to live much longer, so he sold me to my future family, the Wheatleys. I was renamed when I arrived at my new home. I got my new first name, Phillis, from the ship I arrived on, the Phillis.
My masters were Mr. and Mrs. Wheatley, John and Susanna. People believed that they bought me because I was frail and would show their financial status, but I believe they truly missed their deceased daughter, who died at the same age of 7 years old. I was not with them too long before they saw a will to learn within me. They noticed the will to learn when I was caught writing on the wall with chalk. Most masters would have punished me, but not my masters. Instead, they taught me how to read and write. I began learning and couldn't stop. Without prior experience, I learned the English language in the span of 16 months. I learned an abundance of other subjects including astronomy, geography, history, theology, Latin, and Greek. During this time, other slaves and children my age worked around white households completing chores for their masters. They were not allowed to go to school or do anything without their master's permission. I was extremely lucky to have the Wheatleys on my side.
I fell in love with writing, and poetry was constantly flowing through my mind. My first published poem, On the Death of Reverend Mr. George Whitefield, was published in a pamphlet that was printed in major cities like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and London. This poem was the poem that started my poetry career. A few years later, I formed a collection of 28 of my poems. Miss Wheatley helped me try to advertise my poems to be published, but the colonists were not fond of supporting an African American's literature. I was very aware that I was not the same type of person as the colonists. They were treated better than I. Being aware of this, I was conscientious of what I wrote and of my actions. Although it was risky, I sent my work off to London to the Countess of Huntington, Selina Hastings.
The Countess ordered Archibald Bell, a well-known bookseller, to prepare to publish my book. It was finally published in 1773. It was called Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, and hosted 39 of my poems. The poem I am most remembered for was featured in this book. It is called On Being Brought from Africa to America. "'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God, that there's a Savior too. Once I redemption never sought nor knew. Some view our sable race with scornful eye, their color is a diabolic dye. Remember Christians, Negroes, black as Cain, may be refined and join the angelic train." I used this poem to express my feelings and concern for racial equality using the power of Christ to bring light to this important matter.
I wasn't only remembered for the poem and the attention I brought to racial inequality, but also a letter and poem I famously wrote to George Washington. I sent Washington this letter in 1775 to demonstrate support for him and America in recognition of his new position as commander of the Continental Army. Throughout this letter, I commended Washington and his troops for their dedication and defiance of the British. Washington, of course, loved the poem I wrote and had it published. I became known as a voice in the American Revolution, and that could have influenced Mr. Washington. The year after I sent him a letter and a poem, I received a very delayed response thanking me for my talents and with an invitation to meet him. That same year, in 1776, Washington seemed to slightly change his views on slaves. I believe that my writing impacted Washington to change his views. He began to allow black soldiers to enlist in the American Army, as well as even supported a plan to free slaves that would fight on the American side.
I died less than 10 years after my encounter with Washington in 1784 and was buried with my last surviving child.